Hi there, and welcome once again to the Joe Roberts podcast. The title of today's podcast is God, Unified Field and Atheism. That's quite a weighty title, but I do think that I have some insightful and interesting things to say about this subject, which may also be useful to people with open minds. So, I would like to talk a little bit about my experience of God, my way of conceptualizing God, and the mainstream way of conceptualizing God in this world as regards religion and science, and why I believe the most common and prevalent way of conceptualizing God in this world is flawed and also potentially harmful. There is a branch of science, a branch of physics known as unified field theory. The very basic premise of it is that there is one all-unifying force in the universe, one all-unifying maybe particle or essence, something which basically unifies everything in the universe. There's also a term which is used in certain branches of physics, the God particle. My way of conceptualizing God is something along those lines. It's essentially that there is an all-unifying essence in the universe which is indivisible, could be viewed as divine, and I would say probably consciousness itself. It is the generative source of all that is, and it's an essence that's within everything. This is how I conceptualize God. It's kind of like the ultimate particle, if you want to look at it through a science lens. If you want to look at it through the lens of religion, it's the essence of you. It's consciousness itself. It's the generative source of all that is. My way of conceptualizing it, it's not completely unique. I just mentioned a few influences there. New Age, sort of certain more esoteric branches of physics. However, there's a distinct lack of open-mindedness within mainstream religion and mainstream science, which I want you to comment upon in this podcast. Mainstream religion and mainstream science both conceptualize God in the exact same way, and it's such a common and embedded paradigm in our world that it's caused enormous harm, I believe, in terms of how we as a species understand God as a concept. And the mainstream religion and mainstream scientific community's way of conceptualizing God is as separate and anthropomorphic. Mainstream religion conceptualizes God as anthropomorphic and usually something outside of us. The common and I would say somewhat childlike and sophomoric view of God is as some anthropomorphic being, usually in the sky. This is evidenced by the fact that people, when talking about God, look up the way. They tend to conceptualize God as a being in the sky, usually anthropomorphic, vaguely human in outlook and behaviour, and mainstream science just sort of makes the same assumptions, predominantly that it's something outside of us and separate from us, and is presumably anthropomorphic as well, and operating from a sort of human-based ego outlook, usually involving stuff like punishment or indifference to human suffering and the suffering which exists on planet Earth. All of these viewpoints are, I believe, deeply archaic and harmful and have caused a lot of damage in terms of how we as a species conceptualize God and embrace God within our lives. I believe that it is far more healthy and empowering to view it as something which operates from within you and operates through you. I also believe that it's more empowering and useful to us as a species to view this as something along the lines of divine essence, love, consciousness. It's an amalgamation of all of those things. It's the source of all creation itself. It's the sort of love energy, and it's indivisible. However, as I said, mainstream religion and mainstream science conceptualize it in none of those ways. They describe it as something separate from you. When people are praying, I'll just use Christians as an example, but I could just as easily have said Muslims or Jews, they pray to something outside of them, usually. When they are praying, they're not praying in the way to an essence within them that's also an essence within everything in the universe. I could speak a little bit more about the New Age understanding of God because it's a little bit closer to conceptualizing it in what I believe to be the most helpful way, but it's still, even then, not quite there, because even a lot of New Agers pray to something outside of them. They're not praying to an essence within them. So God is everything. It's you, it's me, it's the sky, the universe, the atom, everything, the building blocks of everything that exists. And it's an essence that's within you as well. And it's a loving essence. And it's not separate from you. And it's probably not anthropomorphic, although it is anthropomorphic in the sense that human beings are all a part of it. And it is an aspect of human beings as well. It's the ultimate aspect. It's the creative, generative, divine love aspect of all of us. This is my way of conceptualizing God. Now, I wanted to then move on from talking a little bit about this, in my opinion, rather hokey way of viewing God, to then speaking a little bit about atheism, because it's, in my opinion, a profoundly illogical stance on God. So the basic premise, the basic sort of outlook of atheism is something along the lines of, if you can't prove it exists, then it doesn't. It's ironic, really, because one of the most renowned physicists of all time kind of gave us this wonderful quote to the contrary, and it was Carl Sagan who once said, "Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence." And that's really the most profound way of looking at it if you have your doubts. It's kind of the foundational bedrock of agnosticism as well, which in my opinion is a far, far more logical standpoint to have on this if you are not sure. Now, it's perfectly fine to not be sure. That's perfectly okay. But when you are dogmatically trying to stamp into people this idea that you can't see it and there's no evidence that it exists, therefore it doesn't, it's profoundly ignorant and harmful, because the actual building blocks of physics, even mainstream physics, are that our universe is comprised of matter which you can't actually see. So this kind of highlights how farcical the whole outlook is, because atomic matter itself is not visible to the naked eye, yet physicists expect us to believe, in fact tell us somewhat dogmatically, that that is what our universe is comprised of. Quantum matter, atomic particles, which we cannot see with our eyes, yet we know it's there. So there's a lot of groupthink and closed-mindedness within the scientific community, even in some of the more unusual branches of physics, even in some of the more esoteric branches of physics. There's still this sort of bloody-minded idea that if you can't see it, it's not there, or that the idea of God is pure superstition and is coming from a place of, I want it to be true, therefore it must be true. And there's no sort of creative drive to marry the mainstream religious way of viewing God and the mainstream scientific way of viewing God. And the closest that you can get to it, as I've just said a short while ago, is the idea of a unified field, a sort of God particle, if you will. This idea that everything is connected, everything has an essence, and that essence is what you could call God. The illogical nature of atheism is highlighted very much in the rhetoric of people like Richard Dawkins. He is a textbook example of the closed-mindedness of atheism. You can't see it, therefore it doesn't exist. They claim that the onus is on people like myself who do believe in God to prove that it exists. I would say a good starting point is letting go of the hokey and quite childlike way that we currently have of conceptualizing God in this world for the vast overwhelming majority of people. That's an excellent starting point. So let's let go of this idea that God is just some human being in the sky that's separate from us and operating independently of all of the rest of us, because I believe that in time, I thoroughly believe that in time it will be proven to be an utterly ridiculous idea. It's not something that's separate from us, and it's not something that's operating independently of us. And it's not really anthropomorphic in the sense that it looks like a human being. It's something that operates through human beings, but it also operates through everything else as well. Nature, animals, the sky, the universe, the stars, the sun, water, everything. Atheism makes no logical sense. It's just a closed-minded and foolishly arrogant way of saying, if you can't see it, it's not there, when there's a morass of evidence within that same science to disprove that idea. Agnosticism makes more logical sense. Also, many mainstream atheists are very attacking in the way that they approach the idea of God. This is partly understandable because mainstream religion has done a lot to damage people's belief in God. It has perpetrated a lot of atrocity in this world off the back of its belief in sort of superior deity. But again, mainstream religion's way of conceptualizing God is, I believe, faulty and sophomoric. It conceptualizes it as an anthropomorphic being which exists and operates independently of everything else in the universe, and particularly independently of human beings. And it's also, mainstream religion has also historically portrayed God as punishing and really quite vindictive. So it's not difficult to see why mainstream science and mainstream religion sort of lash out at each other when it comes to this concept, but they do actually have one thing in common, which is that they both generally tend to portray God as something separate from us and anthropomorphic. So they have something in common. I would also like to say a little bit about prayer. My experience of prayer has escalated very quickly over the past few years. As soon as I began changing my prayers from praying to something outside of me to praying to something which is both in everything and within myself, and I began praying in such a way that I was seeing God as an essence within me and an essence within everything, my prayers became vastly more effective, and I began getting the results that people generally tend to want from prayer. Now, the exception to this is when you are praying in such a way that your prayers are motivated by anything fear-based. If fear is driving your prayers, you will generally tend to get a result which forces you to face those fears, and this happens on a sliding scale. The greater the fear, the more the result of that prayer will force you to face whatever fear it is that's driving the prayer. Also, my prayers have generally tended to take shape along the lines that everything you need is already inside of you, all potential exists within you, and I have had a gradual realization that as I become more and more aware when a prayer is being motivated by some fearful idea, I've become more and more attuned to the idea that actually the prayer is not always necessary. And these ways of looking at it have helped me to a great extent. And when you really start to become more and more aware of what's driving your prayers, you will see that fear is one of the most common motivators of prayer. And ultimately, somewhere in your journey, you have to start to become more aware that in the bigger picture, there really isn't anything to be afraid of, including death. So these are some of the things that I wanted to say about this subject. Those were some of my thoughts and insights into the subject of God, unified field, and atheism. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this. I hope it's provoked some sort of thought, helped you in any way, shape or form. Bye for now, and thanks for listening.